Welcome to the Digging Deeper section of this lesson. What the Digging Deeper sections are going to do is they're going to take the material that you've read about, that you've watched on the videos, and we're going to, as the section says, dig and delve a little bit deeper. Often what we'll do is we'll take that material and we'll apply it to real-world situations in the past or the present, and sometimes we'll just take a concept and just learn more about it. In this lesson, for lesson 1, you ended the video sequence, with one video on markets and prices and how prices and the market mechanism allocate resources, and how under certain conditions that mechanism produces an efficient outcome. Okay? So what are we going to do today? We're going to briefly review those concepts, and we're going to then talk about ways in which those conditions for efficiency are violated. Okay? As the agenda says, we're going to talk about imperfect information, too little competition, and how prices are distorted, in particular by externalities. Okay, so let's review. The power of markets. Okay? Well-functioning markets use the price mechanism to allocate resources. And when that works well, then resources are directed to their best use. That is, we get an efficient outcome. Well, what do we mean by efficient, and what do we mean by the best use? Well, when firms are producing what consumers value, and when the firms that are producing them are the low-cost, the most efficient firms, then we've got resources allocated to their best use. Okay? And the role of prices was crucial in making that happen. Firms, they compete with one another on price to try to attract consumers. And consumers, they're looking for the best good at the best price. Those self-interests, it's actually what Adam Smith called the invisible hand. Those people each person following their own self-interest, trying to get the best good at the best price, firms trying to attract customers, will give us an efficient outcome. Okay? So a well-functioning market, for that to happen, what we have to have is we have to have certain conditions in that market being met, which means that consumers should have full information about the products. There should be competition between firms. Firms should be competing for consumers' businesses. And the prices should accurately reflect the full value of the product. Okay. When one of those conditions, or more of those conditions, isn't met in a particular market, we call that a market failure. Now, a market failure, that doesn't mean that the market totally collapses. Okay? What that means is just that market isn't giving that ideal, efficient outcome, that there's some friction there, that there's something going on preventing us from getting resources to their absolute best use. Okay? And as we said, this occurs when one of these three things happens. When there's imperfect information, that is, when some participant in the market doesn't have full information about the product, or the good, or the situation, or when there's too little competition, there's too few firms trying to attract consumers to purchase their goods, okay? Or when the prices don't fully reflect the value of the good. And one of the major reasons that prices can be distorted in that way, that is, the price not accurately reflecting the value of the good, is when there's something that we call externalities in the market. Okay? And depending on the nature and the size of the inefficiency, market failures may suggest a role for government intervention in markets. Government intervention in a way that will push the market closer to the efficient outcome. Okay, so let's dig deeper, and let's first talk about imperfect information. Now, in order for a market to be efficient, That means consumers, when they're shopping around for what to buy, need to know about their different choices. They need to be able to compare one good to another, one product to another. Okay? And it won't be just for consumers that need full information. We'll talk about other examples as well. But in order for good choices to be made on either side of the transaction, the parties have to have full information about the good in question. Okay? And in particular, firms don't always have the incentive to provide the consumer with full or accurate information. And this is one of the major reasons where governments might step in to regulate a market. That is to say, when I say regulate a market, what I mean is put some rules on what has to happen or what any particular participant needs to do. So this is a reason, this possibility of imperfect information is the rationale for example, regulations on product labeling. So if you're trying to pick, say, which cereal to buy, you're walking down the cereal aisle, you may be thinking, well, which one is good for me, which one isn't good for me? In order to do that, you need to know what's in that cereal. You need to know the calories, the sugar, the fiber, all of that. When you look at the product and you look at the label, you can get that information. It's a little bit easier for you to choose among all the different products. And those labels are there because the government has regulated that the companies provide that information so you, the consumer, can figure out the best option, the best product to choose, the best product at the best price. Another example is when investors are trying to shop for or trying to decide which stock, which equity to purchase. Okay, so you've got money, you want to invest in a firm. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, they regulate what firms have to disclose about themselves on financial statements so that investors who are purchasing the equities, so that they'll be able to compare whether they want to purchase a share of this company or a share of that company. Okay. Also, it's illegal for a loan applicant to misrepresent their financial information on a loan application. Okay? And this is because, now this isn't from the consumer's perspective, but this is from the bank's perspective. Now a bank has to choose who it's going to give its loan to, allocate resources in a certain way, who gets the loan and who doesn't. And so when consumers or businesses, small businesses, apply for a loan, they need to put down their information, their financial information, and the law says that that information has to be accurate. Okay. And another example is if you want to hire somebody to work on your house, do some repairs or cut your hair. The government often requires that the people that you hire have licenses, that they've in some way been certified that they are who they say they are. Okay. So these are all examples of where getting more information into the market helps the market participants make better choices. And by making better choices, what we mean is allocating resources to their best use. Okay. And again, so the point we're trying to make here is that markets, to be efficient, to be really good, people have to be able to make good choices. Good choices requires good information, and sometimes the market doesn't always provide all of that information without a little nudge, a little bit of regulation, a little bit of shaping from the government. Okay, let's move on and talk about a little bit more of a detailed example of imperfect information. Insurance markets are rife with what we call informational asymmetries. Okay. When an insurance company is selling insurance, okay, what they want is they want to have a diversified pool in their portfolio. What I mean is, let's think about auto insurance. Right? Auto insurance only works from the insurer's perspective if There's good drivers and bad drivers, because if all of the drivers got into accidents, the insurance company, obviously, they couldn't make that work. That business model is not a successful one. So in an insurance pool, there have to be good risks along with bad risks. Now, the imperfect information comes along here because the person being insured, the driver in this case, in this example, has private information about, say, how good of a driver they are. Or if we're talking about health insurance, the person may have more information about their health than does the insurer. So here there's imperfect information where the insurance company doesn't know exactly all about the person that they're insuring or the situation that they're insuring. And the problem that arises because of this imperfect information is that there can be what's called adverse selection, an adverse selection problem. An adverse selection problem means that it's mostly the bad risk people who are going to apply for insurance. And if an insurance pool has only bad risks, well, again, that's not going to work for the insurance company. It's going to go bankrupt. So because of this adverse selection problem, and again, by adverse selection, what we mean is that the people who are the bad risks, they have the most incentive to get the insurance, as opposed to the people with the good risks, which means if we just sometimes if we just let the market work on its own, the insurance market might collapse. Okay? And this is one of the reasons that we're all required to have auto insurance. Okay? So if everybody has insurance, this means that good drivers and bad drivers, everybody's got insurance, and this makes the insurance market work. When states require that everybody have insurance, they're intervening in a market to make sure that that imperfect information problem doesn't make the market collapse. In the health insurance market, large employers will just automatically provide insurance to everybody. Well, they'll subsidize the insurance. It's not always free. It's never free, but they'll subsidize insurance to try to ensure that everybody who they're employed to has the opportunity to get insurance, which means that there'll be good risks and bad risks in the pool. And again, that makes the insurance market work. This was also the reason behind the controversial mandate in the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. A controversial aspect of that legislation was that everybody was required to have health insurance. And that's because of the adverse selection problem. If you just wait for the people who need it to get insurance, you'll only have the bad risk people. That will make premiums very high. That's not supportable. The insurance markets would collapse. So, again, let me just reiterate. Insurance markets are rife with imperfect information. They create an adverse selection problem. And sometimes government regulation steps in to support that market in the presence of imperfect information. Another example of imperfect information is what we call the market for lemons. Now here we don't mean the fruit, the actual lemons. What we mean is lemons as in slang for, oh, that's a rotten car. Okay. And this is a sort of a famous example of where imperfect information can possibly make a market collapse. So think about it. If you are buying a used car, you have a lot less information about that car than the previous owner. The previous owner knows a lot about that car. But because you don't know about that car, there's a lot of uncertainty. So people shopping for used cars may not be willing to pay a lot for a used car because we just don't know. Is that a good car or is that a bad car? Right? Is that a lemon or is that a good car? So this imperfect information problem can tend to push down the price of used cars because I'm not willing to pay for something that might be a lemon. Because of that imperfect information that pushes down the price of used cars, the only people with used cars who want to sell the used cars for that very low price may be people with lemons. So in this case, we've got imperfect information that will drive the good cars out of the market, no pun intended, and have only the lemons, the bad cars, left in the market. Okay? Now, sometimes we don't need government regulation to fix a market. Sometimes there's a market-driven solution. Okay? The company CarMax, which sells used cars, helps to solve that lemons problem. CarMax buys the cars, puts their stamp on it, guarantees it for a certain period of time, and now the buyer has a little bit more confidence that they're not buying a lemon. Okay, so we've talked about how imperfect information can make a market less efficient, how there can be government intervention, government regulations to try to get more information into that market, to try to make it more efficient. So now let's move on and talk about the next way in which a market could fail, and that's too little competition. And again, when I say a market fail, I don't mean it collapsing. I just mean it's not getting to that most efficient point. Okay, and in order to get to that efficient point, that where resources are allocated efficiently, what we need a lot of firms competing for the consumer's business. Because it's that competition that gets firms to produce things really efficiently, because when they can produce things really efficiently, they can sell them at a lower cost. Resources directed to the firms who can provide the best good at the best price. But in order to do that, they've got to compete with one another. Because if there's only one or two firms, they don't need to compete. They don't need to do that innovation or that reorganization or whatever it needs to drive costs down and deliver the best product at the best price. Yeah. So when we have a market where there's not a lot of competition, then that diminishes that incentive to be efficient, and it drives up prices. Okay. Now, sometimes there's a reason why there's not a lot of firms in the market. Like, for example, electricity. Here in Virginia, there's pretty much one company that provides electricity, that's Dominion. And the reason for that is because electricity production is efficient at a very large scale. It doesn't make sense to have a whole lot of companies providing electricity. It's most efficient when you've got one big firm doing the whole thing. So it makes sense to have one big firm producing electricity. When that happens, we call that a natural monopoly. It's most efficient to just not have a lot of competition. But if you've only got one firm, that means that they don't have to innovate or be efficient to keep prices down. There's not the same incentive. So often what will happen is the government will step in and regulate what prices those firms can charge. So there's a sort of a complicated relationship between the state and the natural monopoly, the electricity company, where the state sets prices and tries to give the company enough profit and enough incentive to keep costs down and to innovate. Okay. There are other markets that are also more efficient to operate at a larger scale, like internet providers. Oftentimes or cable providers, there's just one or two firms that provide that service. Okay. And sometimes that means that the service provided may not be exactly at the most efficient level. So to try to minimize the instances when there's too little competition, what the government does is the government looks over what's called mergers and acquisitions. Mergers and acquisitions are what happen, right? Are when firms combine in any one market to make, of course, a bigger firm. So the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, along with the Department of Justice, the DOJ, they examine most large mergers and acquisitions to try to ensure that in markets where it doesn't necessarily make things more efficient to have large firms, that those markets stay competitive. Okay, so with too little competition, we don't necessarily get that drive to be low cost, to be efficient, to innovate. Sometimes governments will step in to make sure that that doesn't happen, and sometimes governments will step in to regulate when it is more efficient to have one big firm. So let's move on now and talk about prices. Okay. Markets are all about prices, and prices reflecting the value of goods and services so firms and consumers can react and make good decisions based on the value and the cost of the products. There are some instances when the prices of goods and services may be distorted, may not fully and accurately reflect the value of the good or the service, the product. And when that happens, it's most often the case because there's some externality involved in the production. And by an externality, what we mean is that there's a benefit or a cost in the production of that good or service that accrues to a third party that's not involved in the transaction. There's sort of a spillover effect. And when that happens, when there's a cost that spills over, that's external, or a benefit, then the price of that good or the benefit of that good isn't necessarily internalized and doesn't necessarily get built into decisions. Okay? There can be a negative externality, and a negative externality occurs when there's a cost that spills over to a third party not involved in the transaction. Or there could be a benefit, a positive externality. With a positive externality, the benefit of something spills over to a third party, and again, not necessarily internalized or reflected in the price or the value of that product. So, like, for example, a non-economic example. Okay? Suppose you're in a band, and you live in an apartment, and your band practices in that apartment. Okay? Now, the apartment next door, they're hearing you practice. That could be, if you're a good band, a positive externality to that next door neighbor. They get to hear your great music even though they're not in the band. Or it could be a negative externality if the music isn't quite up to their taste. They're not involved in the production of the music, okay, but it spills over to them. Okay. Let's look at it at more of an economic example, starting with a negative externality. And the prototypical example of a negative externality is pollution. Okay. Pollution is a byproduct of some production. So a firm is producing a good, and in the process of producing that good, right, there's a factory, and maybe it's spewing some particulate matter out into the atmosphere or dumping some waste into a nearby water stream. There's a cost of that production. The cost of that production is in the dirty air that other people breathe or the dirty water that other people have to use. The people that are incurring the cost of that pollution, that negative externality, aren't necessarily the ones who are purchasing the product. So that cost of that pollution isn't built into the price of the good. And when the cost of that production isn't built into the cost of the good, that means that people are making decisions on prices that don't fully reflect the cost of the good. Okay? And when that happens, in this case, in the case of a negative externality, when the cost isn't built into the price, that means that price is lower than it would be otherwise, and that means there's more demand for that product, and that product is overproduced. So products that have an uncorrected negative externality will be overproduced. And when I say overproduced, I mean there's more of it produced than would be if everybody were fully realizing the cost of producing that good. Okay. So what kind of interventions occur when there's a negative externality? Well, sometimes sometimes governments will tax the pollution. Okay? So you could think of something like you have to pay, you, the firm, have to pay us, the government, a certain amount per unit of pollution emitted. When the firm has to pay that price, now the price of that pollution is built into the price of the product, because that's a cost. Now the firm now feels the cost of producing the good and the pollution. Now, sometimes that's hard to do. Sometimes it's hard to tax on how much is being polluted or how much pollution is being emitted. There's another sort of market-based way of taxing pollution, of correcting for this byproduct, of correcting for this negative externality. It's run by governments, but it's a market-based scheme, and it's called cap and trade. Cap stands for cap the amount of overall pollution that's emitted, and that may be capped all over, say, the United States, and then you issue permits. So you say, okay, we only want X amount of pollution to be emitted all over the United States. Of all of the firms that are producing that pollution, they get permits to do it. They have to buy the permits. But then they can trade. So different firms might be polluting more, might be polluting less. We cap the amount of the negative externality. That cost of the externality is built into the price of the good. And by doing it this way, we've allocated who gets to pollute and who doesn't get to pollute to firms that are more suited, to firms who are more suited to pollute or not pollute. But what I mean by that is if you're willing to pay for the permit to pollute, you're probably a firm that has a high cost of not polluting. Whereas if you're willing to sell your permit, okay, you may be a firm that is better off, has more capability of reducing pollution on their own. Again, it's all about allocating resources and allowing prices to reflect the cost of all of the cost in producing that good. Okay. All right, so negative externality, pollution. Positive externality. Positive externality is when there's a benefit that accrues to a third party. Okay. So a prototypical example of a good that produces a positive externality is education. Because when we have a lot of educated people, the benefit of that spills over to society as a whole. When everybody can read, when everybody can do math, when we've got people who can think, when we've got people who can innovate, that benefits everybody. And if we all had to pay for our own education, say K through 12, then we would get fewer people educated and education would be underproduced. So it's this positive externality to education that provides the rationale for free public education K through 12, because otherwise we'd get less education and everybody would be worse off. Other examples of things that produce positive externality, vaccinations, because when we have a lot of people who are not spreading diseases, okay, again, that spills over, that's a positive benefit to many people, not just the person being vaccinated. Basic science, the research to basic science. Okay? That again produces externalities that spill over and they permeate throughout the economy. They benefit a lot of other people. And if we didn't subsidize basic research, as we do, sometimes we subsidize basic research through grants, through government grants. And if we didn't have that, we would get less research and we'd have fewer innovations, fewer benefits for everybody. When something has a positive externality, if it's not corrected through some kind of subsidy, then we get less of that good produced than we would otherwise. Okay, so we have run through the different ways in which markets can fail. And when I say fail again, let me remind you that we don't mean totally collapse. We just mean it doesn't get to that most efficient outcome. Okay? Most markets are not efficient. Most markets are not perfect. But markets are powerful mechanisms for allocating resources and getting really good outcomes. No market is perfect, so each market has its own little distance from perfection. Does that mean we need government regulation in every market? Most certainly not. Sometimes government intervention and government regulation does more harm than good. So hopefully the benefit of learning about these different kinds of market failure is that when you think about where government should intervene and where it shouldn't, you can stop and you can pause and you can say, no market is perfect. Where is it that this market fails? Does it lack information? Does it lack competition? Does it have some kind of price distortion? And then is that failure enough that we want government intervention and government regulation? Okay. So again, we've reviewed the ways in which markets can fail with too little information, too little competition, and price distortions. I hope you'll take this and think more deeply about markets and the price mechanism, and I'll see you next time.